Let's configure our build to use a source and symbol server. To do so, we simply go over to our build itself. Here's our build definition for our active project. Again, we're using our Hello World build. Let's right-click it and edit that build definition. In the build definition, we can go to the Process tab. And in the Process tab, you'll see this path to publish symbols. This is our source and symbol server. Again, it's just a file share, which is, I think, very interesting. SRV19432 / and it was source and symbols. That's going to publish our source and symbols to that location so that it can be used later by people doing debugging or testing. Let's save our build configuration, and let's run another build. Let's queue a new build. And while that build is running, let's go to this location. So we've got a build number 3 that's just started. I'm going to open up the source and symbol server, and basically that's just a file share out on another machine. And we can see that already it's dropping stuff out onto that folder. The Hello World PBD, some information for us. The build just started. Let's open it up. The build succeeded. We're done. It hasn't updated here, but now it's updated. So when we go back, we can kind of see what's available here on this source and symbol server. Now, most of this, again, it's not meant to be consumed by a human. You're going to point to this location and other people will be able to do debugging. But you've got basically your PBD information here in a file folder. You can scroll back up and take a look at this 000 admin. We've got some history, some server information. All this stuff, again, is meant not to be consumed by an individual, but to be consumed by debugging tools and the like. But you can see some of the things that occurred here and which version it's pointing to, etc. So those are some of the things that appear in the source and symbol server. Again, you'll never look at those predominantly. And where you're going to make those changes is in the build definition itself by simply specifying a path to publish those symbols. In most cases, the default build number is all you really need. However, there are cases when the build number, for some reason, needs to be changed. You want a custom build number, and you don't want to use the one that's kind of out of the box. Let's take a look at how to do that and what the out-of-the-box one looks like. If we open up our drop location, we have Hello World, and that's the name of our build. And if we open that up, we have folders for each of our individual builds. Now, if you take a look at these, you'll see they're Hello World, the name of the build, an underscore, the date in sortable order, year, month, day, and then .2, .3, .4, .5. Those are the builds as we've gone through the day, the 5th build of the day. So we've done 16 builds so far today. And then the next day, that would simply turn over and start back at .1 again. Now, we may not want this format. The Hello World, the underscore, we may need to change the format to look something different. So to change the format, let's go back into Visual Studio, go back to our builds, and change our build definition again. And in the build definition, it's under Process, and we go down to the Advanced tab. And in the Advanced tab, there are a lot of things you can do with builds. And in order to understand them, it's best to dive into and look at all of the parameters that come out of the box that we can change and do things with. So in this demonstration, we're going to go in and take a closer look at our build and see all of the various configurations we can do. Let's go into the Edit the Build configuration for our Hello World application and go to the Process. Now, we're based off of the default template. Every template has a different set of options, but I want to go through some of these because they're critical into what we can do. So let's take a look. Clean the workspace. Basically, this just says every time I do this build, I want to clean it out. I want to get rid of a bunch of stuff and download everything new into the workspace again. This is the nicest way to do it, but it does put a heavier load against your TFS server because it's getting everything every time. We can get a particular version. We can decide whether or not to label sources. In the build part of this, we can say what project do we want to build? And indeed, we can build multiple projects and multiple solutions as well. You just simply click Add, and browse out to what you want to build. And you could literally build 10, 15, 20 different solutions in a single team build if you wanted to. Also, we can specify what configurations we want to build. So we have our app. Do we want to build it in 2 or 3 configurations? Let's say we want a debug on an NeCPU and we want a release on an NeCPU, or it could be a different one. And in that case, we're actually going to get 2 separate builds. We'll build twice, one for debug NeCPU, one for release NeCPU. So you can do those sorts of things as well. I'm just going to cancel that and leave it off. Do we want a clean build? Now this is a clean get up here, the clean the workspace. We want a true. We can also have a clean build down here. And a clean build is where we're just going to blow everything away, not just the workspace. Everything's just going to be very, very clean as we go and do it. And the output location. Do we want a single folder? Do we want it per project as configured in the solution? And lastly, advanced. Here's where we might pass in some MS build arguments. Now there's a special argument that I really like, and I'm going to share it because I think it's one that is common for organizations that are using architectural validation with layer diagrams. So a layer diagram allows you to define an architecture at maybe an enterprise level or for that application. And then as people are coding, if they violate the architecture, we want to know. And we can do that by passing in an MS build argument. Now there's lots of MS build arguments you can pass in. This is just one. Whack P says we've got a parameter and we're going to pass it in, and it's validate architecture equals true. And this will go through and it'll actually validate the architecture if we have a layer diagram available to us. We can also pass in some script elements, etc. But I want to just briefly point your attention to this again. I think it's interesting, and this validate architecture equals true is something that you may come across. Depends, again, whether you have layer diagrams, but it's a nice thing to know about. Let's dip down now into test, and under test, we can say, do we want to run any automated tests? And if the answer is yes, we need to decide a couple things. First, what tests are we going to build? And here we can open this up and decide whether we have some general test name we want. And then we can say we want to run everything that has a test in its name. Either test.dll or test.apex. We can pass in some options here. Do we want to enable code coverage? You can set custom options here as well, and what the target platform is. Now, one more thing here. Do we want to fail the build on test failure? The default is not to fail the build. The default is that the build succeeds, but it's a partial success. And that lets you know the difference between when the compilation failed and when the compilation succeeded, but the tests failed. So build failure would be a compilation failed, partially succeeded, compilation succeeded, the tests failed. And a success would be the compilation succeeded and the tests succeeded, and the tests all passed. We can specify some criteria here, a test case filter if we like. These are just some of these things that we can set up right here. When we went into the ... we could see that we could set all of these things manually from there. But we also can go in here. Do we have a run settings file? What type of run settings do we have, etc. We also have an advanced section here. Do we want to analyze the test impact? If you have test impact analysis for your testers, it'll let people know when a test has been run, even if it was a manual test, when it was run against a build, and then when it's run, another build is created, it'll tell you if the code that changed between those two builds may have impacted that test. Quick way to find out regressions. Dive more into that in testing information than we would in an administration course. We can also disable tests, run any scripts, etc. with pre or post test. Then we go down into publishing symbols, and whether or not we want to publish our source and symbols, and lastly, advanced. And we might have some agent settings. How long are we willing to wait? We're willing to wait 4 hours for this build. Anything longer, we just want to fail. Name filter. We might want to filter out which agent we want to run. We can say, I only want to run this one, this 32 agent one. This is the only one we want to run it with. We want to match exactly. Now, by default, you really don't care which agent, but you might want a tag filter and say, this is a Java build, so we only want to run it on machines that have the word Java, the tag Java. And we want to match that one exactly, for instance. And it'll show us a list of all these tags if we like. Those are some of the configurations you can set up. You can also change your build number format, create work items on failure, or update work items with a build number as well. So in this demonstration, we really walked through those build process parameters and all the things that you can do to set them up. And in addition, we talked about passing in MS build identifiers like that validate architecture equals true to validate an architecture. Builds that we manually trigger are very, very valuable. If an individual, a developer, wants to test out their build, but not on their local machine because it might be corrupted with lots of stuff, right? And they might be running under administrative privileges and all these other things. They might want to manually trigger that build and simply right-click and run a manual build. However, there are more ways to trigger builds that are built into Team Foundation Server. So let's take a look at what some of those are. If we open up Visual Studio and go back to the Builds section, you'll find our Hello World application again. We're going to edit that build definition and see different ways that we can trigger the build. They're all located under this trigger directory, and the default is manual. Basically, check-ins don't trigger a new build. However, there's a lot of other ones we can choose, and I'm going to show a few of these in this demonstration. The first is continuous integration. This is every single check-in, we're going to get an automated build. Whether we ask for it or not, we simply check in and it builds. Rolling builds are ways that we can accumulate check-ins until the prior build finishes. So let's say that I do a check-in and the build takes 10 minutes to run, and 2 other people do a check-in during that time that the build is running. Well, the next time the build runs, instead of running the first of those 2 check-ins and then the second of those 2 check-ins, it'll aggregate both of those check-ins that occurred during that build time and run both of them at the same time. If you had continuous integration, it would be every check-in would build. Rolling builds is useful if you have a lot of people checking in and it's very, very active. And you can also say, you know, we really want to build no more often than every 15 minutes. So if somebody sets up a build and is running, it won't trigger a build until 15 minutes has elapsed. Now, the first check-in, the build will go immediately. Second check-in will wait until at least 15 minutes has elapsed, and then it will aggregate those. There's also something called a gated check-in, and a gated check-in accepts check-ins only if the build succeeds. Otherwise, it won't do the check-in. Like the rolling builds, we can merge several builds into one gated check-in as well. Lastly, we might want a scheduled build, and this is useful for builds that maybe take a lot longer to run, maybe have a massive amount of tests that need to go with them. In that case, we can say, for instance, build every single day of the week, including Saturday and Sunday at 3 a.m. It'll only build if we've had changes checked into version control, or we can say, nope, build every single time, even if nothing has changed. What these are useful for, let's say you've got a bunch of builds and the unit tests run pretty quickly, but you have a bunch of integration tests and user experience tests and UI tests that run maybe over the course of 2 to 3 hours. You don't want to run those on every build, but you may want to run them every night. Now, that scheduled build just simply kicks off at that moment in time. What I'd like to show now in this demonstration is a continuous integration build. So let's set this to be continuous integration and save this build. And look at our Team Explorer. Notice that we have this build, this Hello World build that completed 6 minutes ago. We don't have any other builds. But I'm going to go to the Solution Explorer where we have our actual application, and I'm going to open up the form that I'm working on. And I have this message box that pops up and it says, Hello World. And it's got several exclamation marks. You know, maybe I want to change this to something. Maybe we want to use German and we can say, Guten Tag, Welt. And we've got some exclamation marks there and we can save that. So we made a modification, a change, and then let's check in those changes. So we can go and check in those changes. That brings us to our pending changes. Changed hello to German. and we'll check in those changes. Now, very rapidly, when that check-in occurs, I want to swap back over and go into the builds directory. And notice that we've triggered a new build for that change set. It's set up by continuous integration. So that build is now executing, and we can open it up and see that execution. Looks like our build succeeded. Everything's working well. We have an associated change set that we can see here. Change set 14, it's when I changed hello to German. That's what triggered the build. An association was made to that. So that's the various controls that you have when you're setting up build triggers. And you've got a lot of those build triggers. And later we'll look at the gated check-in workflow and how that one is slightly different and quite powerful. We can use that one as well. Once you've got some builds running, you're probably going to want to drop those builds into a location so that you can open it up and see what's happening. For instance, you may need to test that build. You may need to have that build in a location you can deploy from. Most of the time, you're going to be dropping your build somewhere. So in this demonstration, we're going to be talking about using a file share and dropping your code, your build results, into the file share. Let's go ahead and do so. Open up Visual Studio, and in the builds area, we're going to right-click our Hello World build and edit that build definition. You know, we can walk through the various places here, but one of these, the Build Defaults tab, says copy the build output to the following drop folder. Now this needs to be a UNC path. So we're going to use a file share that we have on our network that's sitting on a different machine. It's sitting on SRV 19432. And it's the drops location, and it automatically pops up here. Let's select it, and this is where we want to copy this output. When the build runs, we want to copy it to that drops location. So let's go ahead and save that, and let's re-execute our build. We're going to queue a new build. We're going to run our latest builds, and it's going to drop it to this drop location. Now the build just started. Now while we're waiting, let's go ahead and open up Windows Explorer and go to that drop location just so we can see what's happening. We can see already it's created a Hello World folder, and it's got the name of the build, Hello World _ and the build. It's the date, .2, which means it's the second build today. If we go back quickly and look over here, we'll see this is the build. It completed 18 seconds ago. So we know that the build is there, and this time when it finished, it dropped it at our drop location. We can open up our drop location and notice we have Hello World as an application. Let's double click it, and you can see the application works. It pops up, say hi, we click it, and it says Hello World. So it actually deployed our application to that file system. Now, a couple notes that we need to care about is the build service itself needs appropriate permission to drop to this drops folder. Now, we've done a couple of things. If you set up your build services to run under NT Authority, network service, what you're going to need to do is make sure that all of those network service machines have write access to these drop locations. If instead you use a build service account that all of your build services run under, then you only need to make sure that that one build service account has permission to this drops folder. So that's something to consider when you're deciding whether to use network service or whether you're using a build service account, a specific service account for it. So in this demonstration, we've simply created a build drop folder or linked to a build drop folder, and we've compiled our code and dropped it out to that location. Sensible build defaults are really the way you want to go, so that when you have an automated build, it builds the way you pretty much need it to 95–99% of the time. However, there's cases when you want to override that and maybe build an earlier version or change some of those parameters. Team Build supports that with the use of parameters, as you might guess. So let's go over to Team Explorer, right-click, and queue a new build. Now that's going to give us our default build. But if we go over to parameters, we can make a couple changes. Now before we get there, let's show you that we can make changes here too. We can change the drop location for this build right here. But probably more importantly is the parameters. And here we have all of the build parameters that we had before, and we can start to decide what we want this build to do. For instance, do we want to label the sources with this build? And we might say no. In this case, we want that to be false. Do we want, we can go to the Advanced tab here, we can start to pass in some MS build arguments. Like I might have deploy equals true or something like that if I wanted to deploy it, and I had that MS build argument. It was something that the build would understand. We can go into the tests and we can disable tests for this particular build. The advanced one, should we create a work item on failure? No, and we don't want to update build numbers potentially. We just want to get this one to just run and build, for instance. And I think one of the neatest things here is this version, and we can get a particular version. Now I can say, for instance, D 14 December 2013. And actually, I need to make sure that that's a parsable date format. Something like that would be parsable. And then it would go in and find a build from long ago and grab that particular date and run the build. Now, I don't have anything that old, but you can do things like that with a date. You can do things with a label. You can say L and then provide a label, something like my label. That'll go and get that version of it and build it. Or you can do it by change set. I'm going to use C14 and go get version 14 of the change set and queue it. Our build is executing. We can open it up and look at it. And looks like it completed successfully based on that particular change set. Notice up here that the administrator triggered it for change set 14, which is an older change set in our version control system. So that's how you set up and you execute a build with parameters and changing parameters for that individual build. In many cases, you want to keep a particular branch clean. You don't want to allow people to even check in code that's going to break the build. You want to keep it nice so that you always have a reliable build, at least a successful build, out of that particular branch. So to do so, you can set up an automated build against that branch and then set it for gated check-in. And in this demonstration, we're going to walk through setting something up for gated check-in and show how that works. So let's open up Visual Studio. And in Visual Studio, we're going into the builds, and we're going to change the build definition for Hello World to work with a gated check-in. So let's go to the trigger, and in the trigger, we're going to change this build to gated check-in. Now we're going to use all of the default things. We're not going to change any of those, but we'll stick with gated check-in. We're not going to necessarily merge or anything like that. Let's save it, and then let's go back to our Solution Explorer and make a change. Basically, this is going to make sure that we have a legitimate check-in. I'm going to go back to our form, and we're going to change this back to English from Guten Tag Welt back to Hello World. Save it, and let's go ahead and commit those changes. I'm going to commit them slightly differently this time. I'm going to go to Team Explorer and look under my pending changes and do a check-in here. Change back to Hello World in English. And check that in. Now, during the check-in, it's going to prompt me. And it says, you've got to build your changes for validation before they're willing to be committed, before it's going to commit. So what it does, it creates a shelf set for me. And that shelf set is based on this build definition. It's a gated shelf set. And we can take a look at some of the options for that, if you like. And we can preserve the pending changes locally. Now, one thing I can do is I can bypass that validation build and check in my changes directly. That requires some permissions, so I may or may not want to do that, but I don't want to do that in this example, so let me uncheck that. And we're going to build these changes. Now notice if the changes are built successfully, they'll be checked in automatically for us. Your check-in has been queued for validation. Click here if we like, so we can click here to see more information. You can see here that the build request has been processed, and it was requested by me for check-in shelf set using Hello World for the active project. Finished 7 seconds ago. It waited for 3 seconds in the queue, then completed, and we were done. So when it got completed, let's go back and look at some of our history and see if it actually got committed. So to do that, in our Team Explorer, we can go back to look at our Source Control Explorer. And I can right-click Hello World and view its history. The change set here, you'll notice, we've got here change set 15, change back to Hello World in English. That's our commit. So we were able to check in and it did it for us. And it added something here. This *** no _CI ***. That tells the build that even if there's a continuous integration build, to ignore it. I mean, it already just finished a build to do the check-in. So it doesn't want to then re-execute a continuous integration build once it's checked in. So in this demonstration so far, we've seen exactly how we can trigger this gated check-in, and we can set ourselves up for a gated check-in. But I want to show you one more advanced thing. And to do that, we're going into our builds one more time, and I want to change it away from gated check-in. So I'm going to edit the build definition and go back to continuous integration here, or we could even go to manual and save that build. And we're going to make a change in our Solution Explorer. And we can change this. Maybe we're just going to get rid of some exclamation marks. We think it's a little silly to have all of those. And we just say hello world, period, and save that. And we're going to go commit that. But before we commit it, we're a little worried that it might not work. So we're concerned that the build will fail and we don't want to be embarrassed and check in a bunch of code. So we can self-inflict an automated build. And to do that, let's go into our build definition, right-click Hello World, and queue a new build. Now notice we have not yet checked in our changes. But in here, we can go, what do you want to build? Instead of latest sources, we're going to say latest sources with a shelf set. Now, it doesn't have a shelf set for us. We can go ahead and create a shelf set. And we'll call it trying this, ... whatever we like. And we're going to shelve that. And we can say check-in changes after a successful build. So we're basically self-inflicting a gated check-in on ourselves. So even as an individual, we can go in and do this gated check-in. And when I queue it, notice it's specified here as a gated check-in, and it's going to go through this process nice and slowly. It'll build, it'll compile, but it'll take our changes, this hello, world, period, instead of the exclamation marks, and automatically run those and commit them. So that's a self-inflicted change. And then once it builds successfully, it'll simply go in and check in. Now, while that's building, in fact, it might be done already, I want to do one last demonstration. Oh, there were merge conflicts. We had an actual error in this change. So in this case, we had a merge conflict. We couldn't do the check-in, and so it failed for us, which is brilliant. So now we know we need to merge those first before we go in and do another check-in. So that's an example of a gated check-in and what happens to a gated check-in if the build fails. And in our case, it failed because we had a merge conflict. It could have also failed because we were missing a semicolon. It couldn't pass the tests, anything else as well.
In this video, we're going to take a look at how we can access tag profiles in SharePoint 2016. So to access a tag's profile, you first need to go to the actual tag and the tagged item. So let's go to our Documents library, and we can select our Employee Emergency Contacts, which I know that we've tagged. So let's click on our Files tab on our ribbon, and mouse over to our Tags and Notes. And here we can see we have this tagged with the word staff. So staff is our keyword. Now if I click on the blue staff under our suggested tags, I can now go to the tag profile for this particular tag. So now that we're in our tag profile, from here, there's a few different things that we can do. So we can see the tag profile, we can view tagged items, we can view all tagged items or tagged items that have only been popular within the past 2 months. Over on the right-hand side, we have our Get Connected section. So from here, I can choose to follow this tag in my newsfeed. So I'm going to click on that, and that's now going to be followed in my newsfeed. And we can see here that the tag listed in my profile's interests. And we can also add it to the Ask Me About My profile. So in that section where we have keywords about stuff that people can ask us about, we can click to add it to that section as well. Now, if I go back to my home page, and if we go into My Tags, there's more work that we can do within there as well. So I'm going to click on my Documents library this time, and we'll go to the Library tag, or tab, and click on our tags and notes. So our My Tags section, when we click on this, this shows us all of our tags and notes, and we can see we can refine by tag. So currently they're set to sort alphabetically, and we can see the word documents is one of the tags that we're following, and the word staff is another. And the word staff is larger because there's more items that are currently tagged with the keyword staff than there are with the keyword documents. Now, up at the top, it's showing us all of our content. If we want to just look at items that are tagged, we can do that. So we can click on tagged, we'll see the activity there on the right hand side, and we can click on any one of these items directly from here. So this is how sorting and finding relevant content to a particular keyword comes in very handy, because you don't have to browse through all of the different libraries and all of the different files to find what you're looking for. If you know that it's been tagged with a keyword, you can simply come to your tags and notes and you can find it. So if I wanted to just see stuff that was tagged with staff, I can click on the word staff and it's going to filter out the other items. If we want to just see items that have notes, we can click on our notes, and here we can see items that have notes. We can see just items that we've tagged with private tags, and we can also see just been tagged as public. So it'll filter out any of the private tags that we've added. So that's how we can access our tag profiles and then go into our My Tags and sort all of the information and find the files and the libraries and lists that we're looking for by using those tag keywords.
When creating automated builds and running them, sometimes it's useful to designate a particular build as having a quality. So for instance, is it ready to go to production? Is it ready to go to the tests? Do we want to discard it? To support that, TFS and Team Build support something called build qualities. Let's take a look at build qualities and what they are. We're going to open up a particular build. So we're going to Team Explorer, and we're going to open up this build. Just a random build, and note that at the top it says no quality assigned. Now we can assign it a particular quality. We can say something like, the initial tests passed. So that one has an initial test pass quality. Now if we go up here, we might want to say after a particular of time, it's ready for UAT. So it's ready for maybe deployment to production or ready for deployment to UAT. I'm not sure what this ready for deployment means in this environment. So we'll look at how to specify that and make it a little clearer as well. And maybe something like it's under investigation. We can set these builds to particular build qualities. Now there are tools such as the TFS deployer that look at these build qualities, and based on the build qualities will automatically publish these out to your various environments, do deployments for you. But this isn't very clear to me. When I see this lab test pass, which comes first? Ready for deployment? Ready for deployment where? Let's go in and change these build qualities. And to do so, we're going to open up something we haven't seen yet. If you simply double click Hello World or Build, it brings us to this page. And this page shows us all of the builds that have executed, as well as their build qualities. And note, we haven't set any of these build qualities yet. And we can filter out for build qualities, etc. This is kind of a nice view. Here, by the way, are 2 builds that we retained indefinitely. We want to retain indefinitely. But we're focused on the build qualities and changing that dropdown. So if we float up here, there's a couple things we can do. And one of them is manage build qualities. There are other things as well, managing build controllers, queuing new builds, etc. Let's focus just on managing build qualities. When we click it, you can see we have all of these build qualities. And there's a lot of them here, and frankly, I don't know this structure, and worse, they're alphabetized. So under investigation comes after ready for deployment. So I might want to change all these, and I might just want to remove all of these and then add my own. Now, if I prefix them with a number, then I get a nice workflow. So I might say ready for deployment to test and add that one. And then I've got another one, which is passed initial test. And I might add a third one, which is then ready for UAT, and 4, passed UAT, and 5, ready for production deployment. And I might even want to have a 6, which says, this was deployed to production. Maybe, maybe not. All depends. But if I specify my own build qualities, then when I'm in a particular build, I can say this build, make sure we refresh. It's always a good idea to refresh. That helps those changes that occur on the server be brought down locally. And now we can say this one has passed its initial test. And when I drop down, I like having the numbers, or you could try to think of them so that they alphabetize nicely. But here you can see I'm kind of going through a workflow. Ready for deployment, it passed its initial test, it's ready for UAT. At some point, I may move that to its past UAT. And then when we're over here, again, we can see those individual deployments and build qualities, and we can filter on those build qualities. So in this demonstration, we've talked about build qualities, and we've also talked about how to customize those build qualities to potentially make them clearer or more effective. One thing about builds and automated builds is that they can run so often that they start to overwhelm the storage capacity you have on your file share. So we have a drop location and we keep just putting more and more and more and more stuff into it. Eventually, we're going to run out of disk space. And in that case, our builds will start failing. So we want to prevent that from happening. And there's a couple ways to do that. One is just be very, very conscious of going out and cleaning up those workspaces. But that can be a little bit problematic. Instead, we want to rely on Team Build to go ahead and do that for us. So let's open up Visual Studio and go back to our Hello World build, and let's set some retention policies. So we're going to edit that build definition. And at the very last tab, we have something called the retention policy. And then triggered and manual builds have their own retention as well as private builds. Now, all of the builds that we've been doing so far are these triggered and manual. You want to maybe just focus your attention there. On private builds, I can ask for a build privately as a developer, and I may want to keep those around as well. Generally, you keep fewer private builds than public builds. Now, a stopped build is one that someone was executing and they reached in and just canceled it. And they might have canceled it for a reason. Something failed, they wanted to stop in and debug, or something was going wrong. We really only need to keep the latest one of those stopped builds around. We probably don't need a lot. But let's say we wanted to keep 2. We could keep 2 latest builds. If it's a failed build, we're keeping the latest 10 failed builds. Then we could do comparisons across them. That's probably reasonable. Probably wouldn't take too much. A partially succeeded build is by default a build that compiles successfully but is failing tests. Those test failures we could cause to fail the build as well, but by default, we leave it partially succeeded. We're only keeping the 10 latest of those. Now, the successful builds, we're only keeping 10 of those. Now, I'm a little bit concerned we need more of those. Come over here to the latest and drop down and say, specify the count to keep. And then we can specify how many builds we want to retain. And I may want to retain maybe 100 of those things. If I'm doing continuous integration, probably 100 is still a lot. You're probably going to want to keep it less, but you can specify whatever you want. And on the what to delete, you can say, we want to delete basically everything. The drop, the labels, the symbols, the details, everything. Or we could specify to drop just the details about it, or just the drop location. You can specify what to delete here as well, to specify we also want to delete, for instance, test results. You can specify what you like, really depends on your needs. Let me just very briefly walk in through here and show you what these are. The drop is the drop location, so you're cleaning up the hard drives. The test result cleans up TFS because you're getting rid of any test results runs. The label removes the label from TFS in version control, so you don't even have that label there any longer. And the symbols deletes what's out on the symbol server itself. So you can specify all of these or none of these. Let's click OK. And that's how we can set up our retention policy. Now I'm going to save this build, and I'm going to come back and look at our builds over here. And notice this build that completed, this .4 build. If I right-click that .4 build and say, man, I really thought that was an important build, I can also specify retain indefinitely. And when I retain that build indefinitely, what that means is it will not participate in those deletions. It doesn't count in the 100 successful builds that I'm keeping, so I would have 101 now before it started deleting. And you can have as many of those retained builds as you want. And this failure might have been a very important failure, and I can also retain that one indefinitely as well. So that's how you set up retention policies, and also how you can retain builds indefinitely so they don't participate in those retention policies. Team Foundation Server comes out of the box with 3 great process templates: the Scrum process template, the Agile process template, and the CMMI process template. But sometimes that's not enough. You want to customize it, you want more power, you want more control. That's where process template customization comes in. To do a process template customization, you can do things independently inside of a team project, or you can change the entire template that you use for future projects. Now in this demonstration, we're going to be talking about making changes to the process template that you can then create new team projects from. So to do that, we're going to open up Visual Studio. So you open up Visual Studio, and under the Settings window, there's something called the Process Template Manager. So we're going to click the Process Template Manager. Once we're inside of that, you see we have multiple process templates. And the first thing we need to know about editing process templates is how to download an entire template. So I'm going to pull down the Microsoft MSF for Agile Software Development. Let's choose that one, and I'm going to click Download. It's going to prompt me for a location, and I'm going to go ahead and drop that right on my desktop, or let's put that in the Downloads folder. We'll drop it right in the Downloads folder. We simply select the folder, and the process template downloaded successfully. Now let's go take a look at what's involved in a process template. Let's open it up, and I'm going to the Downloads location, and you'll see that we have the MSF for Agile Software Development process template here. We're going to open it up, and we see several things in here. We see a process template XML document, and this defines how all of these other things are coordinated. Now, then we see lots of different areas within it. So we see, for instance, build, and we can open it up, and there's an XML document in here that defines how things get built. You can open it up and take a look at the setup. So you can see here we have some basic permissions, readers, contributors, build administrators, and all of the permissions and what they're able to do. So when we create a new team project, it looks at this and it spins up and configures our team project according to some of these things, like allowing view build definition rights to people in that administration group. Now the same thing is true as we walk through the template. There's some classification items, and these classifications are things, let me open it up for you. Things like iteration 1, the areas and iterations that we're going to be using. And also a link to the file mapping, which is the Microsoft project file to determine how project interacts with items in this process template. We can close that and move to the next one. Groups and permissions defines things like well, like it says, what groups are available and what permissions do they have, much like we saw in the build one earlier. There's the lab area that covers the lab management and how that's configured. There's the reports, and if we open that up, you'll see there's a bunch of RDL files in here, which are the actual reports that get uploaded. So if we wanted to, in our custom process template, we could create our own reports, and then they would participate in that project creation. Looking back again, we have test management, version control, SharePoint services, how all these things coordinate. And one of the most important that we'll be coming back to lately is something called work item tracking. And that defines things like the types of links between work items, the process that things are used, how do these work items interact and interrelate with one another. And the various queries, we can go in and define new queries that we want uploaded when our project starts, when a new project is created. And then type definitions. And this is where we're defining what are the fields, what does it mean to have a bug work item type. It defines the process that it goes through, new, active, resolved, closed, for instance, and what fields are available. All of those things are defined in these XML documents. And we're going to be coming back to these later. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to step up and show you now how we can create a new process template. Now, I'm not going to make any changes to this one per se, not in this demonstration, but I am going to do one quick edit on this process template file. And it's just simply the name. I'm going to change the name to Skillsoft Agile Process version 1.0. And then we could do a definition like this template is flexible and will work great for most teams. We could get rid of that and say at Skillsoft. Something like that. Just something very, very simple. We're not making big changes. We're going to save that and close it. Now, it's in a directory that's called MSF for Agile Software Development, but that's not going to matter when we actually do the upload. Still, for clarity, if you're going to leave it on your machine, you probably ought to rename this folder. Again, doesn't matter, but we're going to rename it as Skillsoft Agile, just so that later on when we come back, we'll know that this is from the Skillsoft template. I'm going to go back to Visual Studio at this time, and in the Process Template Manager, I'm now going to upload our new process template. Now, granted, we didn't make any changes to it, but except for the name, but that's okay. That's all that we need for this demonstration. Let me go to Skillsoft Agile, select that folder, and it uploads the process template for me. Once that process template is there, we can then use the process template to create new team projects. One last thing, I can select it and I can say, please make that the default. So from now on out, every time we create one, the default will be this Skillsoft Agile process. So in this demonstration, you've seen a quick overview of what a process template is. We've also downloaded a process template, made a change, and uploaded a new process template. Many times with process template editing, you're going to run into problems. You're going to run into errors. You're going to forget something. Plus, it's pretty complicated. There's a lot of interdependencies between things that are in this XML file. I'd like to point out a few of those and point you in the right direction for troubleshooting. So first, let's introduce some errors. I'm going to go back into our Skillsoft Agile process template, go back to classification, and let's go ahead in there and grab this XML document and edit it. Now you see these iterations, 1, 2, and 3. I may want to rename those as sprints. So I'm going to go up and I want you to pay special attention to that right there. I'm going to go Control H and I'm going to replace the word iteration with sprint. And I'm going to do that throughout the entire document. Now notice what just happened. In that search and replace, I've introduced a potential problem. This name up here is not a name that is very flexible, right? These are just labels and we can do whatever we want. But this is referring to a structure that is baked into a Team Foundation server, this top level node. So we need to rename that back to iteration, otherwise we'd have a problem. So I'm going to save this, and now one would think we have a perfect process template. Let's make a mistake, however. I'm going to go in here and not close this XML document. I'm going to take that out right there. Just kind of leave that open and save it. Now, one of the things that I recommend you doing is if you have IE installed, you can open up classification in IE. Now notice it didn't even display. Nothing appeared. IE is very good at not doing anything if the XML document's not well formed. So that's a good thing to do to kind of check out and make sure your document's at least well formed before we upload. But let's try to upload it anyway. I'm going to go back to our Process Template Manager and let's upload this document. Going back, selecting the folder, clicking OK. Do we want to overwrite it? Absolutely. And it almost immediately fails to upload. And we can see the error log for those details. And here it says, the node start tag on line 8, position 14 does not match the end tag of line 11, position 13. So we kind of have an idea of where the problem is. Let's go looking. Line 8, position 14, somewhere between there and line 11, position 13. We can reopen it. And sure enough, if we count down the appropriate number and then we start counting over, you'll notice that this is where it said there was an inappropriate thing changed. We're going to go down and we know where the problem is. Let's go ahead and close this element and save it. Now everything should be working appropriately, and we've learned a little bit about how to troubleshoot. As we save it and close this, I'm going to leave it open because as we go in here to upload it, you're going to find out that we still are going to have a problem. Let's select this folder. Everything's clear, everything's nice. We're going to overwrite it, and bingo, we have another problem. This time, let's open up that error log for details, and we can see what it's done successfully, starting the validation, etc., etc., etc. Oops, we have an exception. And it was triggered right here when it was running the task group creation 1 from group groups. It gives you the time, gives all of the details, and it says the following area or iteration path is not defined, iteration/iteration 1. Now we changed all of those, but notice now we're in maybe a different area, something referring to groups. So we might have this dependency across. So this helps us go find out where some of these might be occurring. Let's close it, close this, and let's go looking. If we pull open this one more time, I'm going to reopen that classification. And here it is, sprint 1, sprint 2. We're under this iteration, and I don't see anything here about groups. So let's close it, go up one, and sure enough, there's a little groups and permissions. Let's open that up. Once we're inside here, let's Control F and search for iteration. It told us that was a problem. And when we find next, we see that sure enough, we've got iteration right here, and it looks like there might be a problem. Now, once again, this is this main upper level iteration that we don't want to change, but these things are broken. It told us it couldn't find iteration 1. So we're going to change these to what they were in the other side. Sprint 1, sprint 2, and sprint 3. Save it, and now we've made another change. We found that dependency. Let's close it. Close this. Reopen Visual Studio into our Process Template Manager. Upload again. Get to our Skillsoft Agile. Select that folder. And this time, our process template uploaded successfully. We've been through the problems. We did some troubleshooting. We were able to discover where that problem lied. Now, I want to talk about one other way. This UI does validation completely for us, so we can validate. There's also a tool, a command line tool called witadmin, W-I-T-A-D-M-I-N. And as part of witadmin, there's a command called import process config. So we can type witadmin, import process config, and type in a bunch of details like the collection and the project that we want to apply it to, as well as a /v. That /v validates the process template. So if we're at the command line, we can still get all of these same errors and whatnot by simply passing in a /v. The UI automatically does that validation for us and gives us that log in a nice textual format that we can open up and copy and paste from, as opposed to just appearing in the command line, which is why we did the demonstration here. So in this demonstration, you've seen a little bit about how you can dive in, make a few changes, and then troubleshoot those changes in the process template management that you're doing. Now we've downloaded process templates and we've uploaded process templates, but let's make a more substantive change. We want to change the way our process is enacted. And one of the ways we can do that is by defining particular areas and iterations that by default are created when we create new team projects. Let's go ahead and do so. I'm going to open up our Skillsoft Agile process template again. And under that classification area, we have the classification XML document. We're going to open that in Notepad, and down here where we have this area path, let's go ahead and inject some actual structure. This right now, it's an XML node that's closed, or an element. Let's open it and put the closing down beneath a little bit further. So we'll drop the closing of that node element here. Now I've taken the liberty of cutting and pasting a little bit of code. So I'm going to paste that in here now. And that really is just this structure that I want to create. Now notice up above here, I have this node structure, and with the children, I've got the same thing here, that node structure. But here, I'm also taking a node and providing an extra children area where we have some subnodes. So we have database, business objects, the user interface area, as well as web and phone. So I'm adding a deeper hierarchy. I'm going to go ahead and save that, and we're going to upload this because we're making now a change to our actual process template. Now I could go back to Skillsoft Agile and change this to, for instance, version 1.1 of the template, but let's say I want to keep it at 1.0. I'm going to go back here to our Visual Studio, back to the Process Template Manager, and we're going to upload that process template. Once again, we simply need to select the directory and click Select Folder. Now, this is where it gives us a warning. It already exists. Do you want to overwrite it? We'll click Yes. Once the process template is uploaded successfully, we can click OK, and we have our new process template up there. But we should verify, we should validate and make sure we do see those areas. So let's close this out and go back to our little connection, our little plugin, and create a new team project. Let's call it Skillsoft Demo. And we can have a description of the team project if we like. Click Next, and we're going to select our Skillsoft Agile Process 1.0. Next, we're not going to create a Sharepoint site. We were going to use Team Foundation version control, and let's click Finish. The team project created successfully, so we can close this, and we can go into that Skillsoft demo, take a look at, for instance, maybe a work item. We'll add a work item, and we'll create one of these new work items. Let's create a new user story. And most importantly, what we want to see is, did that area change? We have the Skillsoft demo, but we drop down, and sure enough, we have business object, database, and then our user interface, which we can expand out, and we see phone and web available right here. So in this demo, we took a process template that was already downloaded. We made some modifications to it, in this case, the area paths underneath it, to kind of build a structure out for our application. And then we have uploaded that to the server and created a new team project based on that to validate that it did indeed make a change to our process template. When doing software development, you'll often want to decompose your application across several different areas. So for instance, you might have a business object layer, you might have a database layer, you might have a UI layer, and that UI layer might be broken down into several sub areas as well. Additionally, you may want to split things over time. So you might have release 2.1 and then several sprints or iterations before you get to release 2.2 or 3.0. So those sorts of things are called areas and iterations. And there's something that you can configure inside of Team Foundation Server. And it's done on a per project basis. So let's take a look at how to do that. I'm going to open up Visual Studio, and you don't have to come from Visual Studio. You can also come in from the web access. Basically, to do so, I want to go to Settings. We'll click the Settings portal. And work item areas and work item iterations are two links. Let's go into areas for our reporting project. You'll notice here that we have a reporting project, but it has no sub areas. So we want to create a structure, and we can do that by adding a new child. So this might be our database. And we might want to add another new child, and that's our business objects. And we may want to go up and add our user interface. And beneath our user interface, let's add another new child, and we'll call that our phone UI and our web UI. Let's say that under our database, we also have a SQL Server database. So I'm going to add a new child, SQL Server DB. I'm going to add one in an inappropriate location. You'll see that this belongs not here under web UI, but under the database. If you accidentally make a mistake, you can simply drag and drop them to the right location. So this drag and drop is nicely enabled. Now, when you create work items, you can place them into this structure. Now, one quick note, if you do have something, for instance, in the web UI and you decide to delete the web UI, you're not deleting any of the work items that go with it. In fact, it'll simply prompt you with a warning that says, hey, do you want to move these somewhere else? Let's do that. Let's create a new child under web UI and just call it HTML. And we decide that that's kind of redundant. We don't actually need it. We can right-click it and delete that area. And it'll tell us, if we delete it, any work items, tests, and everything else, where do you want to move them? And we'll just move it directly up to web UI. So we can click delete path and it'll automatically move those for us. Now we can do similar things when we go to iterations. Simply slide over and click on iterations. And with iterations, you see we have release 1.0, release 2, 3, 4. This may not map to our actual one, so we can right click and we could delete it. We could create a new child, etc. In our case, let's simply double click it and go in and specify that this is release 11.4. That's the one we're working on next. Next thing we can do with releases is set a start date and an end date. So we could say that this is going to start September 1st and it's going to end, this release, in November 29th. And we can save and close. That gives it kind of a span. And then each sub-sprint can also have a set of dates as well. Now, in the hierarchy, you're going to want to make sure that these dates fall under the release dates. They should be contained because it's a parent-child relationship. That's how you can set dates for those things. One last thing to talk about before we leave areas and iterations is the setting of security. So we could go into any of these, like Sprint 1, and you can right-click and set security principles on this. So we can add permissions. Should we be able to create child nodes, delete this node, edit this node, or view permissions of this node? Now these currently are set. If they're not set, they're just brought down hierarchically. But we can go ahead and clear any explicit permissions and then add very specific permissions. If we add permissions, and we can add groups here, this can restrict who has access to what inside those iterations. Now let's do the same thing, but inside areas. Let me go back to our areas, and let's say that the database that's maybe more sensitive. So we can set the security, and we don't want anybody reading what's going on inside that area. Area security is a little bit more robust than iteration security. So let's go in and say our contributors to this, they have an inherited allow to edit work items in this plan and to manage test plans. But if we go to readers, we may say, we really don't want readers to be able to do really anything. We don't even want to have view permissions in this node. So we can take away their view permissions and set those to deny so that they have no ability to go in and actually view things inside of that node. Now, one thing about deny permissions, and it's important enough to restate, deny permissions are more powerful than allow permissions. So if you happen to be a member of both the readers group and the contributors group, and you have a deny permission set for readers and an allow permission set for a contributor, you will be denied because you are a member of that readers group. I'm going to undo these changes just so that we have a nice consistent one and close it. So in this demonstration, we've seen how we can configure areas and iterations inside of a team project. There are many ways to manage security in Team Foundation Server, and a lot of times what you really just need is the default security groups. So in this demonstration, we're going to walk through and talk through some of the permissions and things that are available inside the default groups. First, I'm going to open up Visual Studio, and we're going to go to Settings, and from within here, we can look through the Team Project Collection Administration as well as Team Project. Now we're going to start at the Team Project Collections and look at Group Membership. And the Group Membership on the Project Collection are who belongs in each group. So let's take a look at Project Collection Administrators. This is where we're going to put all of the administrators for our team project. There might be build administrators that are separate, build service accounts. Now the service accounts are all of the services that are going to have the appropriate permission in Team Foundation Server. There's also the proxy service accounts, and we might have some of these as well. Service accounts, any service account that needs access to TFS should be in here. Test service accounts appear here. And then valid users. Now you can't add members to valid users directly from valid users. It's basically an aggregation of all of the valid users of all of the projects inside this project collection. So it's a collection of all of the valid users. Valid users, if you want to add somebody to it, you add it to any other thing, like a project collection administrator. Add it to here, it'll appear as a project valid user. So this group you don't edit too much. Now we also have Windows groups, and Windows groups aren't managed by TFS per se, but for instance, inside of project collection administrators, we could say we want all domain admins. So we could come in here and add a Windows user or group and check for domain admins. And if we take the domain admins and save changes, we can add that group into this Team Foundation Server group. Now, anybody who's added to the Active Directory domain admins group will automatically find that their permissions have been granted for project collection administration. Now, we can also drill in, these are groups, we can also drill into users, particular people who have permissions against this TFS server. And lastly, let's roll back, and you can get here from a number of different ways, but I'm going to get here from here again to show you how you can get to the security settings as well. Now again, it just brings us to the same web page, but here we're going to have security permissions instead of members. The old one brought us here. We could also just click permissions. And in here we have what can a project collection administrator do? And here are all of the things that they're allowed to do. Now they're allowed to do a lot of things. The administrator group, by the way, can't be modified. But if we go down to, for instance, valid users and allow what they're able to do, we'll see that anybody who's a valid user can create a workspace, but maybe not create a new project. By default with valid users, be very, very cautious that you leave this to not set or allow. If you deny it here, it'll be denied for everybody because everybody is a valid user. So you don't want to use any deny permissions here. Now let's close this off and let's go take a look now at the team project security. This is more common and more where you'll be working with it. So let's go into our security and group membership here. Again, we'll type security to start with. And this is the permission that we get to use, the permissions for this. For the active team project team, that's a security group that's part of a team. They have inherited allow to create tags or to create test runs. You can always click Y here and it'll trace that permission all the way through and show you where did it inherit from? Well, it looks like they're a member of the contributors group. Therefore, that active project team can create test runs. And if we wanted to, we could restrict things here as well. So here are some of the permissions. The build administrators are allowed to delete test runs and create tag definitions and create test runs, as well as manage all of these sorts of things. That makes sense because they're administrators of a build. The project administrators are allowed to do pretty much everything. Now, the two groups that you find yourself using the most are contributors and readers, well, plus administrators. The contributors group is basically where you're going to dump all of your testers, all of your developers by default. So they're able to do a lot of different things. Basically, they have all the permissions that they need to do their day-to-day job. Now, you might take away for the developers the allow manage test configuration and test environments, for instance. And we'll see how to do that in just a moment. If we go to readers, you'll see that readers are allowed to do some things and other things are not set. So it depends on who you are when you come in. So if you come in at a various permission set, basically, if you're a reader and you're somebody else, you'll be able to go in and do some of these things. If it's not set, I'm not going to have the actual permission, however. So readers can't create tags unless this is specifically set to allow, or it's an inherited allow, or they're a member of another group. But you don't want to set this to deny, because if somebody's a reader and a contributor, they would not be able to create tag definitions. Denies trump allows. So let's undo those changes and take a look at creating our own group if we wanted to. So we can create a TFS group here, and maybe we want one called developers. And with the developers group, we can then go through and create some kind of permissions that we want. Should they be able to, for instance, manage test environments? And we may disallow any of that sort of a thing and then only allow that for testers. Once again, if you're denied as a developer and you happen to be a tester who is allowed to manage test configurations, you wouldn't be able to manage test configurations. Denies always trump. So you leave these things as not set. And then what happens is you don't have permission if you're just a developer, but you do have permission if you're a developer and a tester. So we'd go in and say developers are allowed to do this, they're allowed to do this. They're not allowed to delete team projects. They're not going to be allowed to delete test runs unless they happen to be a tester, but they should be able to view project level information and at least view test runs. We could save those permissions. We can then, of course, add users to that group as well. So in this demonstration, we've walked through using the default groups and some of those permissions that are available. We've also gone in and shown how to create your own custom group and use that, just in case you needed to create a custom group. In this demonstration, we're going to take a look at modifying and configuring the portal experience. So the portal settings from within Visual Studio. How do you go out to the portal? What kind of changes are possible, etc. So let's open up Visual Studio. And we have all of our documents stored in a document repository in SharePoint. And you can see we have some samples and templates here. We have some Excel reports that are available to us, and all of these are hosted in a document library on SharePoint, and we may want to do some manipulation to that SharePoint. Now, before we do that, let's go take a look at that project portal itself. There's a link here to show the project portal. So rather than interacting through Visual Studio, we can go directly to the project portal. Now this one is for an application called My Demo, and I wanted to spin up a brand new one. So hopefully we're going to get an error here on something like burn rate. I've added a couple work items, so as soon as it queries, we'll be able to see that. Excellent. So we have just what we expected. We have this burn rate, and there's an error here on our burn rate. Basically, what's happened here is that we've got a state parameter that's not valid. It doesn't really matter what this error is. I just want to point it out. When you brand new create a team project, it's hasn't yet propagated through all of the reporting infrastructure that really lights up this dashboard. So what happens is you're going to get this error, and the error will persist probably for up to an hour. I want to show you because most times people freak out and they start troubleshooting and doing all this crazy stuff when in reality they just need to wait for the cube to finish processing. One thing to note here is here are some work items. Here's a task, a user story that were created. I have a recent check-in here that was committed. This is really nice in that it's tying right back to my Team Foundation Server project. So how does this SharePoint site tie with that project? Let's take a look at how that's configured. And that's configured back in Visual Studio. If we go to the My Demo settings, you'll notice there's a Portal Settings tab, and I'm going to click that Portal Settings tab. And you can see that the Team Project Portal is enabled. It's using this SharePoint site, and there's a Reports and Dashboards refer to data on this team project. If I uncheck this, all of those things that I pointed out earlier, the report that's currently broken but will light up, and the queries that point to those various work item query and latest check-in queries, those would be broken. Those would no longer connect. So in order to do that, you can go to the website to read more about it. We need to make sure that that is enabled. Now you can configure the URL up here. This configure URL is where the URL should be pointing, and it's to configure the one above it. It doesn't have anything to do with this lower one here, other than it's got to point to the same place. So that's how you enable the team project on that site for SharePoint. Now, there's a couple other things that you might want to do. You may want a team project portal, but you really don't care about having any of the SharePoint/TFS stuff enabled, the reporting in SharePoint. In which case, you can get rid of the reporting here, simply use any SharePoint site and go there. Let's say you don't even have SharePoint installed. Then you could go down and just use this particular website, and you could point it to just anything. This could be mysite.com/stuff. As long as it's a real URL, anytime anybody goes to the portal, it'll simply bring them out to that site. Now, if you use a website and you don't use SharePoint, you won't get some of those document libraries and things installed. So what you wouldn't find, let's just cancel this because we're not making a change. What you wouldn't get if you point to a normal website is this link to documents that allows you to see all of the documents that are on that SharePoint portal. That's one of the advantages of SharePoint. So in this demonstration, we've shown how for a team project, we can configure if reporting shows up in SharePoint. We can configure if we want to even use SharePoint at all. And we've done a little bit on how we could possibly change the URL to SharePoint.